Was God justified in punishing the Hebrew people since they did not follow the laws that he had laid down for them? Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome to another week of Torah portions. This week we are in Leviticus 25 through the end of the book, and we're also in Jeremiah 16, 19 through 17:14. These are the final three chapters of the book of Leviticus, or laws that God had given to Moses for the Jewish people. And so I want to just kind of read the first part of chapter 25, and then we'll get into a little more of the conversation. So Adonai spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. He said, "Tell the people of Israel, you are to enter the land I am giving you, the land itself, and observe the Shabbat, a rest for Adonai. 6 years you will sow your field, 6 years you will prune grapevines, gather their produce, but in the seventh year is to be a Shabbat of a complete rest for the land. A Shabbat for Adonai. You will neither sow your field nor prune your grapevines. You are not to harvest what grows by itself from the seeds left by your previous harvest. You are not to gather the grapes of your unintended vine. It should be a year of complete rest for the land. But what the land produces during the year of Shabbat will be the food for all of you. You and your servant, your maid, your employer, anyone living near you, your livestock, your wild animals, on your land, everything in the land that produces may be used for food. You are to count 7 Shabbats of years, 7 times 7 years, that is 49 years. Then on the 10th day of the 7th month, on Yom Kippur, the most holy day of Israel, you are to sound a blast on the shofar. You are to sound the shofar through all the land. And then you are to consecrate the 50th year, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all the inhabitants. This will be Yovel, or Jubilee, for you. And you will return everyone to the land he owns, and everyone is to return to his family. That 50th year will be Yovel, Jubilee, for you in that year are not to sow, harvest what grows by itself, or gather the grapes of unintended vines, because it is a jubilee. It will be holy for you. Whatever in the fields produce will be food for all of you. In that year of jubilee, every one of you is to return to the land he owns." The idea of giving rest to the land, my recent study from Rabbi Baruch said this was intended for the people of Israel. Now, I've personally witnessed farmers in parts of Washington state that have followed this themselves. And the question is, wow, I'm going to leave my entire land without harvest. And then it takes a full year to have that harvest produce. So you're basically without food for almost 2.5, 3 years. And so you would immediately think this is a difficult task. Now, the farmers I witnessed that lived around me, they would have basically 3 fields. One was resting while the other 2 were producing, and so on and so forth. So they were constantly moving from one area to the next, etc., to try to give the land rest in between. God swore that he would provide during those off times. To my knowledge, and I could be wrong, but to my knowledge, Israel never did this. And later on, they both, Israel and Judah, were punished for that choice. One went to Assyria and the other one went to Babylon. And God created the Shabbat, or the Sabbath rest, for the land, as he commands us to do the same. So I started by asking, is God justified in punishing people with the responsibilities that he's given them? So that, God gets a bad rap in the Old Testament because he's an angry God. He's always punishing. He's doing all of these things, and all of a sudden he's a nice guy in the New Testament in the guise of Jesus, Yeshua. And so the thought is there's 2 different gods. Well, in fact, if God says and proclaims he's the same God yesterday, today, and tomorrow, He's the same God in the Old Testament as he is in the New Testament. The original writings of the Bible, Adonai, Jehovah, were the one and only words that were placed throughout the entire Bible as God. So there was no different distinction. So it's very clear that God was the person, or the God that was going to return to earth in the book of Revelation. He is the God that's returning. I think it would change your perspective knowing that God the Father is the one that comes back to earth. Yeshua has been replaced in some of those scriptures because he is considered one and the same with God. And so we're not going to go quite there today, but the point is that God gave Moses and the people of Israel laws. Leviticus is another name for laws. And they were commands. They were not suggestions. They weren't, if you're feeling it today, you should do this. And specifically, he asked for Shabbat's rest, not only for themselves, but also for the land itself. And he also promised to provide for the people during that time of rest, for the land and themselves. And as I just stated just a few minutes ago, that Rabbi Baruch believes it was just for the Israel people in the land that they were returning to. I think God still blesses those that want to honor the entire Bible. That's kind of what our commands are too. And so, any rate, that's kind of the backdrop of this first chapter, and it also mentions Jubilee. So we have a thought. If I said to you slave, your immediate thought might be, a picture of chains and whips and all of those types of things. But a slave back in the time of Israel was either someone that owed a debt to somebody else, and so they were enslaving themselves to pay off that debt. And in some cases, captured societies didn't want to die, so they chose to be slaves for the people of Israel. And we'll find in Joshua that specific thing took place, and they were water gatherers and woodcutters and different things that they, manual labor type of things that they took on as their role to survive and not be put to death. So with that understood, people are selling their lands if they can't afford it. They're enslaving themselves to a debt. And God had made a provision that every 50 years, the Jubilee, and it happens on Yom Kippur, so you would know the time of year, and that in that time of Jubilee, all debts were forgiven. Anyone that was a slave was free to go back to their families. They could buy back property. And the interesting thing is actually the debt on those properties were given back to the people. But he also made a provision for a number of years from Jubilee as to what the debt would be for that piece of land or that time served, etc. And so he very clearly knows the human mind. And so he stated very emphatically that you're not to alter this based on the timing. So if it was a week left to Jubilee and you needed somebody to take care of your land for that week, you couldn't wait that week and then start a 50-year plan again. That it would be a curse to that person to attempt to do that. And so God, in all of his fairness, made it very clear that you're to charge accordingly, for the time away from Jubilee to the next Jubilee. And so, as with every society, people end up poor for whatever reasons. In some cases it's because of doctor bills. Some cases it's just a string of unfortunate events, and that you need help and assistance to get through. And he had provided a no-interest way for people to receive assistance from the first family. And if the family couldn't do it, then they could go to an adjoining tribe or other people for help. And interestingly, once again, these provisions and these laws that are being laid down, they don't own the land yet, but they haven't gone back in to claim their original inheritance. And so these are future laws for the people. And so chapter 25, continues about slavery and that particularly the people of Israel, they're allowed to take their families back with them. We'll find in Numbers and other areas where people that are enslaved, so again, foreign people, they're only allowed to be free themselves, and the rest of the family has to stay enslaved, but they can turn around and say, no, I want to be part of your family. And then they'll put it all in the ear, and they are now permanent property of that owner. And it wasn't like modern slavery as we know it, where it was some of this was by choice. People made themselves slaves to pay off debts, and so they were treated kindly by the person because they were hired people, and basically their wages were what they owed, and in essence they were getting a very good value for the work that was being returned in terms of the debt. And so very fair in the sense that God knows our frame. He knows our capability of wanting to change, to find the slightest opportunity to alter his rules, and in essence make it different than what it is. So he tries to take away all the loopholes that are possible in his commands. In chapter 26, once again, it reminds them not to make any idols or erect carved stones or standing stones. And says again, verse 2, keep my Shabbats and revere my sanctuary. I am Adonai. He was very concerned that they would worship idols. The surrounding nations, as we discussed before, had their own idols that they worshipped, and if they were prospering, obviously the Jewish people thought that was a good God, and if they weren't prospering, then obviously that was a bad God, or the God was being taken over by a different God. And the emphasis on chapter 26, verse 3, if you live by my regulations and observe my mitzvot, laws, and obey them, I will provide rain in your need in season. The land will yield its produce. The trees in the field will yield their fruit. Your threshing time will extend until the grape harvest, and your grape harvest will extend to the time of sowing seed. You will eat as much food as you want and live securely in your land. He is promised. That's a promise. God just made a promise to the people. If they follow his laws, he will provide. And there was just a huge trust. They had to trust in God. And I know we fall short. If you go all the way back to Adam and Eve, they had a one law mitzvot, and that was do not eat from the tree of knowledge and good and evil. That was it. And we can sit there and point blame and say, oh gosh, they failed, but we would have failed too. And I think I've mentioned this before, but they had a one-word law. Now think of all the different laws, because times are changing. They're about to take over land that was originally theirs, and they are now having some different rules because different society at this point in time. So there had to be more regulations put in place because they're getting homes and lands, and there's going to be a lot more flocks and different things that are going to happen, and the trade is going to start to happen. That's going to come with the society. And so he continually wants them to be fair to each other, and that will translate out to other people that come to Israel. They're going to be treated fairly as well. And if they're holding a good standard, they're not going to allow themselves to be taken advantage of. Therefore, the whole system would stay legitimate across the board. So people would know that they couldn't come and try to cheat the Israel people without consequence. And so God says here very clearly, I will turn towards you and make you productive, increase your numbers, and uphold my covenant with you. Okay, so he's explaining what happens in the year of Shabbat when the land is sitting dormant. You will eat all you want from last year's harvest and throw out what remains of the old and make room for the new. I will put my tabernacle among you, and I will not reject you, but I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so that you will not be slaves. I have broken the bars of your yoke, so that you can walk upright. However, if you do not listen to me and obey my mitzvot, my laws, if you loathe my regulations, reject my rulings, in order not to obey all of my laws, but cancel my covenant, then I, for my part, will do this to you. I will bring terror upon you, wasting disease, chronic fever, to dim your sight, sap your strength. You will sow your seed for nothing, because your enemies will eat the crops. I will set my face against you, your enemies will defeat you, those who hate you will hound you, and you will flee when no one is pursuing you. God is very specific. He's given them all the opportunity for blessing, but he's also explained what happens if you choose not to follow that path. And I don't think that's any different for us. And it's, it's easy to say God winks at sin and allows you to, it's okay to just say, please forgive me, and move on, and then repeat that same sin is what that's inferring. God does not want that. God wants you to walk uprightly, and it's not an oppressive situation. Paul will say, everything is lawful for me, but not everything is good for me. So in other words, you can drink, but why you drink, if you drink in excess, you're not of sound mind, and you're opening yourself up to vulnerability when you choose things that, again, aren't illegal, but they can become sin amongst themselves because of the extreme decision that you're making to go in that path. And so this is no different here than it is for us, right? Yes, we don't, maybe we're not landowners, maybe we're not shepherds or care for flocks, but we have, for the most part, jobs, and we are possibly in the position of weights and measures in a sense, and God is asking us to be forthright with our choices in that area. Chapter 27, and so God, finish up 26, he really emphasizes the land needs to have its own Shabbat. And he says very clearly, if you don't follow that, I'm going to have to basically do it on my own, and I will make sure that it happens. And so in just a minute or two, we're going to talk about Jeremiah today. And again, the warning went out. God warned them here, and if they followed his plan of remembering these and reading these once a year to the Israel people, then they would be constantly reminded of what God expected of them. In chapter 27, Adonai said to Moses, tell the people of Israel, if someone makes a clearly defined vow to Adonai to give an amount equal to the value of the human being, the value you are to assign to a man between the ages of 20 and 60 is to be 50 shekels of silver, 1.25 pounds, with the sanctuary shekel being the standard. If it's a woman, 30 shekels. If it's a child, 5 to 20 years old, assign a value of 20 shekels for the boy and 10 for the girl. If a baby 1 month to 5 years of age, 5 shekels for the boy, 3 for the girl. If a person past 60, 15 shekels for the man and 10 for the woman. If the person is too poor to be evaluated, set him before the priest, who will assign him a value in keeping with the means of the person who made the vow. Jesus would say very clearly, instead of making vows, just make your yes, yes, and your no, no. Don't be wishy-washy and, vow to follow God no matter what if something's not going right in your world. That happens a lot. Even though it's popular on TV, God, remove me from this situation. And then they totally turn around and not even follow what they promised God. And so But God is asking here, he held them accountable to their vows. Whatever they said, they were accountable to that vow. There's some uh, later on where there's a way that if a dad hears a child making a vow, he can override that. If a husband hears a wife making a vow, he can override that. And if he keeps silent, then that vow is locked in place. And so they were very much held to their words. If they said something, they held to that. And God, right here, is basically saying, if you make a vow, here's what the value of that vow is to me. And so, as a person, and you could do animals, there's provision for that. But that is making an agreement with God. You're making a vow to Him that you're going to do something. And that God would act upon you for that choice. But you might decide, I'm going to not, let's say, that you eat steak every day or whatever, just as a really extreme example. And then you make a vow, I'm not going to eat steak for the next 6 months and, read the Bible every day, something like that. I mean, I know that's kind of a silly thing to say, but there's different reasons you would make vows to God. Some of it, I think, more so it's because you're lacking something or something's happened to you or one of your family members, and so you're going to vow that you're going to pray 10 minutes a day every day regardless till they're healed, that kind of a thing. And so, but God, no matter what that choice was, you were to go to the priest and they would set a value to that, and then God held you accountable to that. And if you chose not to fulfill that vow, there were consequences to that choice. And so that's 100% why Jesus just said, say yes or say no, and no need to make a vow over it. And if you're walking uprightly, there may not be a need for a vow. If you're following God, you may not be stumbling, you may not be having issues. God would be blessing you. But there might be a vow that you want to praise God because of all of the things that He's been doing to you. So that not every vow is a bad thing. It's just that James said, our tongue is good and it's also a viper. It can be very bad, and so it's better to keep silent than to just speak it out. What's that statement? Better to let someone think that you're a fool than open your mouth and they discover that it was accurate. I'm going to move to Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah 16, 19 through 17, 14, this is the consequence of not following God's laws. And it's a quick read. We'll just start here. Adonai, my strength and my fortress. So this is Jeremiah talking. It's a prayer. This is God speaking to Jeremiah to the people. My apologies. Adonai, my strength, my fortress, my refuge in time of trouble. The nations will come to you from the ends of the earth, saying, our ancestors inherited nothing but lies. Futile idols, completely useless. Can a person make himself gods? In fact, they aren't gods at all. Therefore, I will make them know, once and for all, I will make them know my power and my might. Then they will know that my name is Adonai. Judah's sin is written with an iron pen. With a diamond point it is engraved in the tablets of their hearts, and on the horns of their altars. As they remember their children, so they remember their altars, and their sacred poles by green trees on the high hills. My mountain in the field, your wealth and your treasures will be plundered. Because of the sin of your high places throughout the territory, you will relinquish your hold on your heritage which I gave you, and I will make you serve your enemies in the land you do not know, for you have kindled my fiery anger, and it will burn forever. So here he's already talking about idols. What is the first commandment? You're not to make idols. You're to love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, right? And no other gods before Him. Nothing. And they've done this, and these high places that they've created, sacred poles. God's saying that because they decided this path, there's going to be consequences for that choice. It continues, a curse on the people who trust in humans, who rely on merely human strength, whose hearts turn away from Adonai. He will be like a tamarisk in Avra. When relief comes, it will be unaffected, for it lives in the sun-baked desert, salty and uninhabited land. Blessed is the man who trusts in Adonai, who will be his security. He will be a tree planted near water. It spread out its roots by the river. It does not notice when the heat comes, and its foliage is luxuriant. It is not anxious in the year of drought, but keeps on yielding fruit. Psalm 1 is very similar to that as well. The heart is more deceitful than anything else, and mortally sick. Who can fathom it? I, Adonai, search the heart, test inner motivations, in order to give everyone what his actions and conduct deserve. So God knows exactly what you're thinking, feeling, and your plan is. And so he does not like lying, slander, gossip. I think we talked about that. Severot, leprosy, it's known modern days, but basically he will show that outwardly if you choose that path. A partridge hatches an egg it did not lay. Like this is those who get rich unjustly. In the prime of their life, their wealth will desert them. In the end, they will prove to be fools. Throne of glory, exalted from the beginning, O holy sanctuary, hope of Israel, Adonai. All who abandon you will be ashamed. Those who leave you will be inscribed in the dust because they have abandoned Adonai, the source of living water. Heal me, Adonai, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved. For you are my praise. So this chapter continues, however, for today that's where it ends. But again, God is telling the people, you're going to, following the path of against my laws and commands is going to lead to destruction. And I already said the people of Israel were taken to Assyria. They took over their entire land. And the people of Judah were taken to Babylon. It was 70 years later, so the land got its rest before they were even allowed to come back to that area. They're now a nation again in 1948, so God's promises maybe didn't happen as fast as maybe at this time they were hoping, but his promises are true. If Israel is wiped off the face of the earth, God is a liar, and he's promised they are not going to go away. And so he's held to that promise. God makes a promise, it's ironclad. He's not going to take away from that. So the law of gravity, he's not going to alter the law of gravity to save one person if they choose to jump off a cliff or fall off a cliff or whatever. The law of gravity is going to be enacted. So he's not going to go against that. But God isn't going to go against his word either. He's not going to alter his word to pacify a group of people or a person so that they're content in their choices. No, he's made it very clear. Here's what's the case. When you go back to, for example, King David, and he had Bathsheba's husband killed. God was, very disappointed, obviously, and he said, if you wanted another wife, I would have provided. But the choice that David had made, he said, I can't stop the enemy from coming. So in other words, he's already made that choice and opened the door to the enemy. God had forgiven him for that sin, but now that choice that he had made, the consequences are now coming forth. And so he explained very clearly that, yes, you are forgiven. Messiah is still coming through your life, your lineage, but I cannot stop some of the things that are going to happen to you. And he laid those out very clearly. But David, being a man of God, and this is why he has this reputation, accepted his blame for his choice instead of trying to blame it on somebody else, and sought to please God. And was he fallible? Absolutely. I mean, we're no different than he, and he's no different than us. But his heart was 100% fixated on pleasing God, even though he was faulty as any man that's been alive. So, at any rate, that's kind of the, here's what happens with sin. It doesn't mean that God won't forgive you. Those that are saved with Yeshua, you're secure in heaven, but that doesn't give you a credit card to go out and do whatever you want without some sort of choice that could alter your life because of the decisions you're making. If you decide to have sex and contract AIDS, God may not choose to heal that AIDS and you may die in that. But that doesn't mean he didn't forgive you for that choice. And so it's just God wants us to live good lives, fulfilling lives. He promises to provide. And there's joy in that because he can take away so many worries and thoughts and just allow you to do what you want to do in a lot of ways that are, correct. But at the same time, allow for you to worship him and thank him for keeping you safe, healthy, and able to meet the next day. So, okay, so next week we're going to start into Numbers, and so the book of Numbers, the original name of that book, by the way, was called Into the Wilderness because that's where they're headed. So, any rate, thank you again, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.